Coming to you from Beaverton, Oregon today. This is GovLove, a podcast about local government brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, Senior Consultant at RefTelis and GovLove co-host. We've got a great episode for you today. We're going to be talking housing in Spokane, Washington. But first, the best way to support this podcast is to become an ELGO member. Engaging Local Government Leaders is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government, and your membership helps support this podcast. So if you want to hear more great stories and more great interviews like the one we have today, become an ELGO member. Now, let me introduce today's guest. Spencer Gardner is the planning director for the City of Spokane, Washington, a position he's been in since 2022. And prior to joining the city, he was a transportation planner for 12 years for Tool Design Group and HNTB, two private sector planning and design firms. He has a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a bachelor's degree in economics from Brigham Young University. With that, welcome to GovLove, Spencer. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Cool. So we have a tradition on the podcast to do a lightning round, to get, let you warm up a little and get to know you a little better. So my first question for you: what's the last great book that you read?
That's a good question. As I thought about this a little bit, the book that came to mind is a book called Dominion by a writer named Tom Holland. It sort of tracks the history of what he calls the Christian Revolution. So he kind of starts out with the history of crucifixion as a capital punishment, and then talks a little bit about the time of Jesus and his crucifixion, and then follows, I guess, kind of Christian thought over the centuries and traces it into the modern world. And I think the great insights are where he identifies the ways in which people probably don't realize how what he called the Christian Revolution has really shaped our modern world. It is essentially Western culture, but I think we take a lot of it for granted. Just it's sort of the air we breathe. So we don't notice a lot of things that actually do have their roots in that time period. So very interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Very cool. Awesome. So my next lightning question for you: what was the first album that you bought?
So I don't remember for certain, but I'm pretty sure it was Collective Soul's Disciplined Breakdown.
Oh wow. Very nice.
As a 12-year-old boy, that was the pinnacle of music for me.
Yeah. Very cool. All right, next lightning question: cake or pie?
Both at the same time.
Preferably. Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. I think I agree with that sentiment. Yeah.
Might depend on the pie, I guess.
Yeah, true. Does it complement the cake? Yeah.
That's right.
All right, and then the last lightning question for you: where do you go for inspiration?
I take inspiration wherever I can get it. I'm a pretty deeply religious person, so I take inspiration from my house of worship, but I also find inspiration just being out doing my kind of day-to-day things. I bike to work every day, and I find that's a really good time to, I guess, just be with my thoughts. It's a pretty calm bike ride, so unless I'm hurrying to get to a meeting, which happens more than I would like. And it's a good opportunity to just kind of think as I'm biking along.
Yeah. You're in the moment, and that's awesome. All right, and then one of my favorite things to ask folks is their path to local government and the position they're in today. So I gave a little bit of your background in the bio, but I'm curious, kind of in your own words, how'd you end up working as a planning director in Spokane? What was kind of your path to this position?
Yeah, it was unusual, I would say. So as you noted in the beginning, I spent the first bit of my career as a consultant. I finished school in 2010, got my master's degree in Madison, and the market at that point was very bad for planners. And, for a lot of people, that was just 2 years after the financial crisis.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure most of the graduating class came out of school and weren't really sure what they were going to be doing. I had made a connection with my eventual supervisor and through some school connections, and we, I guess, kind of hit it off, and he offered me a job. So I knew where I was going after graduation, but it was really not a great market for looking
Mm-hmm.
for jobs. And so I took my first position. That was in Chicago, and that was doing a lot of transit planning, also regional planning. So I got a good exposure to some different parts of the country and kind of different issues around transportation, regional planning. And then after, I think it was about 4.5 years there, felt like it was time to look for something new, and
Mm-hmm.
had an opportunity to join the folks at Tool and moved up to Madison again to work out of their Madison office. And that was a lot of transportation planning, but specifically focused on people walking and biking.
Oh,
And
interesting.
that's as I mentioned, I bike to work every day. I have pretty much ever since I've been working. So that was sort of a passion for me, and it was a great environment, great place to be. Um, After some time in Madison, I grew up out west, and my wife is from out west. So we kind of just felt like we needed to be out here. We wanted to be closer to family,
Mm-hmm.
and we're looking for opportunities to get out here. Um, I had the um, I had the good fortune, I guess, to have permission to work remotely. This
Oh,
was
yeah.
pre-COVID, so a little
Mm-hmm.
bit unusual, but that was starting to be a thing. And so we had the option to come here to Spokane, and I could work out of our Seattle office, but live in Spokane. And so we did that. We came here in 2018, and I worked for another 4 years here. And then in 2022, this opportunity as the planning director came up, and um, I applied for the job. Got to know my supervisor, the division director here, and you know became interested in what was going on at the city, and applied for the position. And I think I didn't follow the process too closely before I applied, but I think the city had some trouble finding a planning director that people were comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
The hiring market right now, it's sort of the inverse of the time when I entered my career.
Yeah, right.
Now it's the employers that are having a hard time finding people, and so I
Yeah.
think the city had kind of gone through that problem, and I guess they, after scraping the bottom of the barrel, they found me flopping around in the very very dregs. So here I am.
Oh, I doubt it was scraping at the bottom, but yeah, that's funny. Um, what was it about this role that like you were like I want to, because there's a pretty big change going from kind of being a consultant for most of your whole professional career to being working in direct service for a city like Spokane. So I'm curious, was there something about position that was like, hey, I'd be able to do, I don't know, work on different things, or what was it that made you want to like make the switch?
Um, well, I think partly it was a desire to be so as a consultant when you're working around the country.
Mm-hmm.
It's engaging work, and again, it was sort of a passion thing for me, and I think for a lot of people in working specifically in active transportation. Um, but I was never really working directly in my own community,
Yeah, yeah.
or rarely, and so I think I saw this as an opportunity to be more actively involved in what was going on around me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that was a big draw. I've been surprised. I think coming out of school, my impression was that consultants get all the variety and the fast-paced work, and it's sort of rushing from here to there, and that city jobs or government jobs were just sort of boring. It's monotonous. You're kind of working on the same thing all the time. I don't really know where I got that impression,
Yeah, yeah,
because I don't think anybody ever really told me that. It was just sort of the way I assumed, I guess, that the world worked. I've been, I guess, pleased to discover that it's every bit as fast paced and engaging and varied as
hmm
consulting. Um, in some ways, consulting can be monotonous because you're
yep,
jumping from place to place, but the work is the same. I mean, you're
yeah,
kind of doing the same kinds of plans.
hmm
So where you get geographic variety as a consultant, I think you get discipline variety in local government,
yeah,
and that's
yeah,
been really really interesting and rewarding. Um, and again, just being able to make a difference in the local community and kind of shape the direction of the city is something that's really really enjoyable.
yeah, yeah. Well, and to your point, in the community you live in, like that's you don't get that right as a consultant, like or maybe one project every few years, but
Right, it's rare, and
yeah,
as a consultant, you're also just kind of doing what you're told to do, and
hmm
um, uh, I think consultants can have an impact on the trajectory of a project, of course, but I think as a worker for local government, um, you're kind of setting the course
yeah,
in a more direct way.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Awesome. So I want to spend most of our time together talking about the building opportunity and choices for all program that y'all have. But as maybe a little bit of background for our listeners that are maybe haven't been to Spokane or don't know much about the city, can you maybe give a little background on Spokane and maybe some of the housing or planning challenges that the city was facing when you came into the job?
Sure. So when I moved here in 2018, I became part of the problem. Uh, people were discovering Spokane.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic place. There's a lot of great natural areas nearby. It's a beautiful setting. Um, there's lots of opportunities here. But it's also, for a city lover like me, it's also a fantastic area for people who enjoy you know nice, pleasant urban environments.
hmm
Um, and I hope I don't take too much time here. I tend to wander in, especially when I talk about um, Spokane. So cut me off if I'm if I'm just
Okay.
if I'm just taking up too much time with stories. But I like to tell some of the history of Spokane, and we really relied on this heavily in our outreach effort for the
Mhm.
Building Opportunity and Choices for All program, because this isn't the first time in our history that we've had housing issues. So I said I became part of the problem in 2018. We were seeing, more and more people move here, and just like everywhere else in the country, house prices were increasing, rents were increasing, people were
Mhm.
starting to feel pressure. Spokane's, I guess, sort of niche in the market, at least in the state of Washington, has always been that we were kind of the low cost option.
Mm.
People could move here, you could afford a home, where Seattle was pricey, and a lot of the West Side communities. Um, Spokane was an option for somebody with a family that wanted to live a reasonable distance from where they work, and wanted to have a little bit of space for the kids to run around, and
Mhm.
it was really a quality of life community at a good price point, and
Yeah.
that was what really attracted me here. Um, so as those prices were escalating and as people were growing concerned, um, the mayor ended up declaring a housing emergency,
Mhm.
and the state had funded housing action plans for cities around the state. So we had completed our housing action plan, which gave us sort of a roadmap for how to deal with some of these problems. But when I started, we started really telling our history, because I
Mhm.
think it's informative. Um, it both because it shows us a way out, and I think also because it shows us how we got here,
Mhm.
or to some extent how we got here. So the history is that Spokane was founded. I always forget the year, but I think it was 1889 or somewhere. It was the late 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
It was a rail stop essentially for the extractive industries, timber and mining that occurred up in the mountains of Idaho and in some of the areas around here. And as you know, when the railroad came, that brought all of the investment and the workers and the economic boom, the first
Mm-hmm.
economic boom. So if you look in the census data from the period of 1900 to 1910, our population grew by 70,000 people.
Oh wow. Yeah.
That was a tripling in
Yeah.
size. So, I mean, we think that we're dealing with meteoric growth right now.
Yeah.
That's nothing compared to what our ancestors were dealing with during that time period.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I and I, you know, the other point that I make, I guess, is that that time period is also when some of our most beloved urban neighborhoods were created.
Yeah.
A lot of the kind of inner ring residential neighborhoods around downtown date back to that time period. So we saw in this an opportunity to communicate with the community about um, I guess, a response to our housing crisis, and really grounded in our history. We
Mm-hmm.
weren't we weren't proposing something radical or new. We were actually pointing back to um, a time period in our past when we had dealt with these problems and done it pretty successfully. I think, of course, there were problems, there were rough edges. It wasn't perfect, but what came out of that time period is the kind of city that the people tell us they want. Our comprehensive
Yeah.
plan really points to some of these older neighborhoods as models for how we want our city to grow, and so we took cues from that, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I can flow from here into what building opportunity and choices for all is, if that makes sense for the. I don't know if you
Yeah.
want to ask a question or.
No, I think that's a good context, and yeah. I think that's good for folks in local government to remember. Like there were housing challenges in our history in a lot of these towns, like especially out west, that where there's a boom and a bust in some places. But yeah, that flows perfectly into the next question about the building an opportunity and choice for all programs. Yeah, what is that? Maybe and then how did you guys settle on that? What is that solution? Then maybe how did you settle on that as something that the direction you guys wanted to go in, I guess.
Yeah, I mentioned that with the housing issues, we prepared a housing action plan that was adopted by council.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One of the strategies that was called out in that plan, and it was really just, I mean, we had a list of sort of action items, but one of those was an interim zoning ordinance
Mm-hmm.
to immediately increase housing supply across the city. And for listeners that don't know, an interim zoning ordinance, at least in the state of Washington, is it's sort of like the other side of the coin from a moratorium. I think most people are familiar with the idea of a moratorium. There's some problem that you need to come in and immediately put a stop to. So
Yeah.
you get special abilities to, without a lot of public process or a lot of um, I guess, barriers in the way. You can just come in and make a change, and it's intended to be on a temporary basis so that you can then go through your regular process to address the problem. So that's the moratorium side. The interim ordinance side is the opposite of that. Knowing that there was a problem and that our zoning was artificially capping our
Mm-hmm.
ability to produce housing in the city, we developed and then council ultimately adopted a an interim zoning ordinance that immediately allowed for the development of up to 4 units on any residential lot,
Hmm.
and also modified some of our lot sizes and other zoning requirements to ensure that smaller houses and townhomes and, I guess, a wider variety of housing types could be built. And
Mm-hmm.
this applied across every single residential area of the city. We didn't carve out one little area and say we're going to funnel all the growth here. In order for this to be successful, we really felt like this needed to be applied across the board.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so, I know you're familiar with strong towns. I think one of the big insights to come out of strong towns is the importance of allowing for more organic growth
Mm-hmm.
and avoiding those artificial caps that can stunt the growth and development of a neighborhood. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think this our effort sort of fits within that vein. What we were really trying to do was just unlock every residential neighborhood in the city for the next level of development.
Yeah.
This wasn't a giveaway of 20-story apartment buildings to developers that wanted to work anywhere in the city. What we were saying is, if you are looking to build some additional housing on your property, let's say you're a homeowner and you have an idea to build an addition, and uh, you so your desire is to build an addition, you want to turn that into an apartment.
Yeah.
um, this gives you that ability. Or um, you may be sitting on an extra vacant lot next door. That's a common situation here. Somebody owns a double lot, they've got their house on one and they have the other one sitting empty. um, but maybe you're getting older, you're tired of taking care of the lawn, or maybe you're just in need of a little bit of cash, and so you have an opportunity to sell that land or develop that land.
Mm-hmm.
We were trying to create opportunities for housing to be built in those circumstances. And under our current zoning, that just wasn't really a possibility.
Mm.
In some cases, it was outright not allowed. And in other cases, the constraints were so onerous that it was just economically infeasible.
Yeah.
So either way, the effect was the same. We were missing out on opportunities for housing and missing out on opportunities for neighborhood growth at a more slow and evolutionary pace
Mm.
than I think American cities have seen, since we started down this path of kind of single family exclusive zoning.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I love the framing of it. The like, it's a building opportunity and creating more choices, because that, I think that like takes some of the scariness out of it, right? You're not, to your point, you're not allowing 20-story, residential towers. It's, hey, what's the next, the next level of development, going from a single family, lot to, four units isn't going to change the character of the neighborhood or something crazy like that, right? So I think that's also interesting. It seems like it's a conscious way that you guys framed it too.
Yeah, I mean, we thought a lot about that. And to go back to my example from our early history, I
Yeah.
think a part of our message was, this is how we dealt with our housing crisis
Yeah.
in the early 1900s. When you look at those neighborhoods that everybody loves, you can walk down the street and count mailboxes, and you discover that a significant portion of the housing stock in those neighborhoods was built as multiple family housing. I mean, it was
Mm.
duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, in some cases even up to six or eight plexes, and they all just sort of fit in.
Yeah.
What we've discovered in the time since the adoption of building opportunity and choices for all is that people don't, overwhelmingly, I mean, we did a lot of public outreach. Nobody really seems to care about how many kitchens are in the house next door.
Hmm.
What they really care about is how large is the building? Does it look like it's out of scale compared
Yeah.
to the rest of the neighborhood? What are the impacts on my property? Do I have a wall looming over my yard? Those are the kinds of things that people seem to be concerned about. We didn't get a lot of people expressing concerns about how many families were going to be living in the building next to
Yeah.
them. That just didn't come up. And so we see that again as an opportunity to rethink the way that we control what kind of development can occur, and
Hmm.
really respond to those community concerns, rather than sort of the brute force limitations on the number of housing units that I think characterizes most American cities.
Yeah. 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 No, that's a really good, interesting point. So, interesting. Yeah. So you mentioned, you increased the cap to 4 units per lot, and then I think, and I can't remember if I read this or you mentioned the zone or lot splitting. Were there other like zoning rules that you changed, like, I don't know, like setbacks or some of the like more technical stuff, like floor to area ratio, like kind of stuff, or what were some of the other things that you you guys are experimenting with to see if that will increase the number of units that are built.
Yeah, we did some other technical things. A couple of examples: we removed floor area ratio as a control on development,
Oh. Mm-hmm.
and that was really just recognizing that we already had controls in place. So the idea of floor area ratio, for listeners that don't know, it's really confusing and nobody understands it anyway. So
Yeah.
I won't even bother. But it's sort of a blunt way, and I guess I would say it's a dumb way to control the scale of building on your site.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and our code already has setbacks. It already has height limits. And so we felt like we were already pretty effectively controlling the size and scale of buildings, and there wasn't really need for yet another control that in some cases was limiting people from doing what they needed to do with their property. So we just removed that outright. Another little tweak that we made was our front setback, the distance that your building has to be set back from the road. We introduced the ability to encroach in that setback with a porch. That was just a little way that we saw to allow for a little bit more building space,
Yeah.
and also to encourage porches, which is another feature of these older neighborhoods, and something that the community has very strongly said they appreciate about a lot of our neighborhoods. And so we didn't want to be punishing somebody for ultimately providing what we see as a public good. And so we created that provision, and that is carrying forward into the permanent changes that we'll be making. And I'm sure I'll talk about that at some point.
No, I mean that's a perfect transition. So that I wanted to ask about. So I know part of this being an interim is to learn some lessons and to work on permanent code changes. So what is that, or how have you guys, I guess, approached that? I assume you're doing. You mentioned community outreach, but then also I assume want to see some of the results of the interim code changes and how they're impacting development. So like what's been kind of the approach to figure out what changes are going to be permanent, I guess.
Yeah. So when if you go back to, I was talking about the interim zoning ordinance and its what its purpose is.
Yeah.
We made our very quick change. It was 1 month from the time we announced publicly the proposal of the program to when it was adopted by council.
Oh wow.
So
That's
that's
like
like,
lightning fast
yeah,
speed.
that's light speed in planning time.
Yeah.
So the idea was to rapidly implement this program so that we could immediately address some of our needs. But we essentially, the bargain with the community was that we would follow that up with the permanent work. An interim ordinance is not intended to be permanent, and we never intended it to be permanent. Our goal was to buy ourselves a little bit of time to then go and make the permanent changes that we already knew needed to be made, and that we were hearing already from the community were needed to help address some of the housing issues.
Mm-hmm.
So after passage of Building Opportunity and Choices for All, we immediately got to work on updating our comprehensive plan. So in the state of Washington, there's a very strong system of having your comprehensive plan drive the development code that eventually implements what gets built around the city.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to update our development code, the zoning rules and things like that, we really needed to update our comprehensive plan in a way that would reflect the direction the community was looking to go.
Yeah.
In other words, the development code changes that were needed to flow from the comprehensive plan that was sort of giving us an overall vision.
Yeah.
And there were elements of of the prior versions of the comprehensive plan that we saw and the community saw as limiting for the kinds of housing types and housing choice that we felt were really needed in all of our neighborhoods. There were just a couple of policies in there that had very specific language about single family homes and residential neighborhoods that we couldn't really, the language is what it is, and it was written in the time period when I think culturally that was sort of the expectation. But obviously times change, and that's why we update our comprehensive plan.
Yeah.
And so in the wake of adoption of the interim ordinance, we got to work on updating that comprehensive plan. we held we visited neighborhoods around the city. The city has a very strong system of neighborhood councils.
Hmm.
So we visited neighborhoods that invited us to come in. We administered a survey that had a larger response than any survey, at least any planning survey that in the time that planning has been at the city, we're not aware of a survey that had more success. We
Wow.
had thousands of responses. Um, we held focus groups, and for those focus groups, we didn't. While it was open to anybody, we didn't just wait for people to show up. We actually reached out to essentially kind of a randomized um, grouping of city residents and specifically invited them to come.
Hmm. Yeah.
And the goal was to hear from people that we don't normally hear from. Of course, we hear from the
Interesting.
people that show up to the meetings all the time and that are highly engaged, and we want to hear from them.
Hmm.
But we were especially concerned about hearing from the people that we don't always hear
Yeah.
from, and so we made a concerted effort. So we probably had over 100 touch points with the community in various ways. We also, made a lot of effort to reach out to organizations and agencies that were dealing with housing issues,
Hmm.
including religious groups and social service organizations. It was really kind of a full court press, and we got a lot of great feedback, and the vast majority of it was very positive. People were excited about the changes that we had made, and they wanted to see them made permanent.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
that culminated in our comprehensive plan being adopted, or sorry, updated in June of this year. So
Hmm.
it was about a 1 year time frame from when
Wow.
our interim ordinance was adopted to when our comprehensive plan was updated. Now that that comprehensive plan has been updated, we have pretty clear direction to update our development code. And so now we are working through the update to the development code. Incidentally, this week, tomorrow actually, our plan commission will hold a hearing on the
Hmm.
proposed updates. And we expect to go to our city council for approval in November,
Oh well.
um, in just next month, for the adoption of the new rules. And those rules aren't super different from our interim ordinance,
Hmm.
but we took the opportunity to be a little bit more thorough and considerate of all of the questions involved, and just, I guess, address things on a deeper level. Our interim
Hmm.
ordinance, because it was done quickly, was very superficial. It has had some effect, but we've gotten some great feedback as it has been implemented, both from developers, but also internally from our own staff about challenges they have with administering it, those kinds of things.
Oh, interesting.
So our permanent change that we hope will be adopted in November is sort of the same spirit, but a much deeper review of our code.
Mm. Okay. Huh. That's awesome. That, and even I don't know what a little over a year. That's still seems like lightning speed to me.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
I guess I'm moving fast.
yeah, it is, and the planning, especially here in the state of Washington, with all of the process that we have around it, which is there for good reason.
Yeah.
But it's not equipped to deal with an emergency.
Yeah.
What's the joke? There is no such thing as a planning emergency.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if there ever was one, I guess we had one, and so we had to deal with it in a way that our normal planning systems just weren't equipped for.
Hmm.
Um, and I think it's been successful. Like I said, we've learned a lot from the
Yeah.
program. Um, it has not been a massive sea change. We haven't had thousands of units built in
Yeah.
neighborhoods across the city. I think the numbers are currently somewhere on the order of 60 or 70 units have been built, um,
That
or
otherwise
sorry,
wouldn't
have been built
yeah.
or permitted, I think.
Okay.
So maybe they haven't gone to construction yet.
Yeah.
So that's a fraction of our overall building permits, but it's
Yeah.
also not totally insignificant. And again, I think for us, it's more about creating this ethic of allowing for incremental neighborhood change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, as I've described the ordinance in public, I've often used the metaphor of a heart attack. So if you imagine somebody who's had a heart attack, they go through the emergency process of trying to get the heart started again, and there's sort
Hmm.
of that first responder need to just deal with the trauma. But the long-term change that happens if somebody survives their heart attack is in the diet and exercise piece,
Yeah. Yeah.
in order to prevent the next one. And I think our interim ordinance, although it maybe seemed like it was the shock, the cardiac shock to get the heart beating again, it was really actually more calculated to start us on a path towards the good long-term practices that we hope will prevent the next housing crisis by allowing for our housing supply to be a bit more flexible and allowing development to occur in all of our neighborhoods.
Yeah, rather than focusing it on one, or hoping for big developments rather than small changes.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So you talked a little about the impact. And you mentioned there were some lessons learned or some things that you guys learned over the course of that impacted the permanent code changes. Are there any, like, I'm sure there are some that are very technical and in the weeds, but I'm just curious if there what some of those maybe lessons learned or that informed kind of the permanent changes.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like an onion. You peel back one
Yeah.
layer and you've got more layers below.
Yeah.
What we did is we peeled back the layer of zoning constraints that were
Yeah.
preventing these houses from being built. But we found underneath that a lot of other constraints. And a great example is some of the engineering requirements that we place on projects. And that's not to criticize those requirements. There's a good reason that we have certain engineering requirements. They protect the community and keep them safe. They ensure that our environment stays clean and is cared for. So I'm not questioning the role of those requirements, but we weren't aware that those would even be constraints
Yeah.
because the zoning was just automatically not allowing these kinds of things. We weren't aware that that was a potential issue.
Oh, interesting.
And
Yeah.
for certain projects that may have been permitted under the zoning, but didn't go forward because of some engineering problem, it would have been seen as just a one-off issue,
Huh.
unique to that particular site or something.
Yeah.
And what we've discovered is that there are actually some systematic problems. And in some cases, maybe those engineering standards can be adjusted to provide for a little more flexibility, or grant or change thresholds at which things are required, or just make other adjustments in recognition of the limited impact of these smaller housing types. I think
Interesting. Yeah.
culturally we had sort of settled into this pattern where anything that wasn't a single family home was basically lumped together. And
Yeah.
so we kind of gave our single family home projects the red carpet, and they got to just waltz through the process, and we weren't really too bothered by what was going on there. But then if you were, heaven forbid, you proposed 3 units or 4
Yeah.
units in your project, because then we basically treated you like you were building 100 apartments next door to
Yeah.
somebody.
Yeah.
And that's just because we didn't really differentiate between the two. We had some of the same standards in fact, we had the exact same standards for a fourplex as we did for a 100-unit apartment building.
Yeah.
And that, in the end, that's just not appropriate. So this is giving us an opportunity to identify some of those constraints and really tease out what is important here and what's not important. Are there
Yeah.
ways in which we can maybe treat these two scales of building in different ways?
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating because, and I'm sure Spokane is not alone in treating a fourplex the same as it would a 10 or 100 unit development. Kind of lumping all multifamily together is not uncommon, I don't think. But yeah, just to start allowing those and then decide and find that, hey, here's another constraint that we weren't aware of. That's interesting. Awesome, very cool. So I'm curious. I know. Urbanist dreams is obviously getting rid of single family zoning, and then but also kind of mixed use. So as you guys have kind of taken a look at your zoning for residential, have you guys thought at all about, like, maybe we start allowing corner stores in these neighborhoods as well? Has any of that kind of mixed use or doing more neighborhood retail come up as part of these changes?
It's funny that you asked that, because almost every single person I've interacted with in the last couple of weeks, including our plan commission and our city council, has asked about corner stores.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
I think if we could rewind the clock, I don't know that we would have done it that differently, but there's a strong desire in our city to be more flexible with corner stores, small retail, neighborhood retail opportunities. Um, that is, we didn't include that in this effort. We felt like it was maybe a little out of scope, and we didn't want to take on too much. I talked about our comprehensive plan and the relationship to our development code. One of the
Yeah.
challenges that we have is that our comprehensive plan, when it was first adopted, had this very strong vision for um, neighborhood supportive retail
Mm.
in our neighborhoods to create these kind of coherent, I guess, self-contained neighborhoods.
Mhm.
It was very neighborhood based.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of good that I think you can attribute to that vision. But the way that some of the policies were written and have been implemented over time have ended up being extremely prohibitive of those
Mm.
kinds of corner stores. So I would say it's for us, it has been a problem with the practice, not the theory or the vision.
Oh, interesting.
And
Yeah.
so we know that we need to make some changes there, but it really needs to start with our comprehensive plan.
Yeah.
So our state mandated update to our comprehensive plan will occur in 2026, and we feel that that would be the appropriate time to really tackle some of those questions. Um, and until then, our comprehensive plan effectively makes these impossible.
Hmm.
So I hear from the community a lot about how they wish that we could be more flexible and have some of those neighborhood retail opportunities. I live in a neighborhood that's older that has some of those opportunities, and I love that my kids can walk down to the coffee shop and get a hot chocolate or a
Yeah.
pastry. And a lot of people want that for their families. Unfortunately, we're kind of stuck with this legacy from 20 years ago that I don't think intended to have the effect that it has had. And
Hmm.
so, in order to deal with that, we're going to have to go through another year-long comprehensive plan update process.
Yeah.
And that's just one of the challenges that we have to face. And so, my answer is, we would love to do that, and we didn't feel like it was appropriate as part of this effort, but it is definitely on our radar, and it's one that I feel really strong community support for.
Yeah. What's interesting, you're hearing from the community about that too, that there's a desire. That's encouraging. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I think again that's what feeds that vision from the comprehensive
Yeah.
plan. I think that's been the neighborhood or the community's desire all along,
Hmm.
and I think what people are realizing is that in practice, the way that that vision was codified into the comprehensive plan and ultimately brought down to our codes, it just wasn't accomplishing what the community was wanting.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Cool. Awesome. So in prepping for this, I also read about a couple of tax exemption programs that you guys have, and for both multifamily and single family projects. So I'm just curious if you wanted to talk a little about those and like what you guys hope to achieve with those programs, because they seem like they're part of this housing, this solving these housing issues that you guys are that it's not obviously the same as the building opportunities and trust for all program, but it's kind of tied up and maybe some of the same goals. So I'm curious what you guys are hope those programs achieve.
Absolutely. So our multiple family tax exemption program, we call it MFTE, is a state authorized program. So cities in the state of Washington have the authority granted to them, if they so choose, to designate areas of their city where projects that meet certain requirements are allowed to um, are exempted from paying property tax for a defined period of time. And there's some more detail in the state code there about what those lengths of time can be and some of the requirements around them, that kind of stuff. Um, our program, like most cities in the state, was pretty limited. We had basically drawn an area around our downtown and then a few limited areas outside of downtown where we provided this, where we administered and offered this tax exemption program. It was used, by projects. It had been, moderately successful. And the way it works is, as a builder, you come in and you build your project, and then if you qualify for the tax exemption, then your property tax bill essentially stays at the level it was before you constructed.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like a cap. It's, for those of your listeners that understand tax increment financing, it's almost like a private TIF,
Yeah. Yeah.
where you cap the tax on that property at a stable level, and then instead of the increment going into a special fund to pay for infrastructure, the increment basically becomes an incentive for the developer to build their project, and they get
Yeah.
to then they get to keep the money. They don't pay taxes on it. So it's just there are very few incentive programs in the state of Washington. We have very strict rules due to the state constitution about giving public dollars to private entities. So we're very limited in the kinds of incentives that we can provide for any project, really, but including housing. And so this is essentially the one incentive that we have at our disposal. And so one of the changes that we made last year is we increased the program in a couple of ways. The first is we felt that over time the boundaries that had been drawn were subject to, I guess, political whims. And so if the right developer came in, then you might have a little more sympathy for expanding the boundary, or if the wrong developer came in, then it was a little harder to do. And I'm not accusing council of having done anything nefarious. I think it's just recognizing that these are people making decisions, and when you are making a decision on a specific situation, it can be hard to separate those political or personal feelings from the decision that's being made. And so one of our concerns was that it was that we couldn't, there was no rational basis for why one property might be included and then the property next to it wouldn't be included. We didn't really have any clear basis for that. And so our approach instead was to propose that we just open up our MFTE program across the city. And our kind of guiding principle was that we want development, we want housing in the city, and we want to reward people who are building housing, especially if it's providing some kind of public benefit. So the way our program is structured is in what we call our target investment area, which essentially corresponds to census tracts with high levels of poverty or unemployment. We grant you, or you can qualify for an MFTE exemption if you build a project, a multifamily project. So this is anything 4 units or more. And if you build that in one of those neighborhoods, you can get an 8-year tax exemption without any additional requirements. And the thinking behind that is these are areas where we are courting and want to see investment. Because we have a lot of there's a significant portion of the population here that is that has challenges through poverty or unemployment or other issues, and so those neighborhoods tend not to see a lot of investment. And while of course we're concerned about displacement and that engine can rev up to a point where it becomes maybe harmful to the neighborhood, at this point none of those neighborhoods has reached a level that causes concern. And so we're actually wanting to see investment in these areas, and so we are essentially putting our money where our mouth is, and we're willing to grant that tax exemption if a developer is willing to come in and develop in one of those areas. In other locations, including in these distressed areas, if you want a 12-year exemption, you can qualify for that by providing a percentage of units at levels that are affordable to the median income or to lower income households.
Yeah.
So, and the numbers vary a little bit depending on the size of the project, but it's essentially 30% of your units. So if you had a 10-unit building, 3 of those units would be restricted to renting to somebody that qualifies under our income rules. And again, that's mostly lower income families or what I think most people would call workforce housing. So these are, teachers, firefighters, those kinds of things. So our program allows you a 12-year exemption if you meet those requirements, and that's open across the entire city. And the goal there is that we didn't want to be preventing the development of those kinds of units in neighborhoods that have higher incomes. In fact, we see that as a good thing. We want a mixture of incomes across the city. So introducing projects that have an affordability component seemed like a big win for us.
Yeah.
And then the last is our 20-year program. I should say, for the 12-year program, that affordability requirement lasts for the length of the tax exemption. So for the 12 years that you get your exemption, you have to keep those units affordable. After the 12 years, there's no requirement that you keep them affordable. What we've found is that in some cases, the projects that have that early on, 10 or 12 years ago, qualified for our MFTE program, some of those actually continue to rent at affordable levels. So even though the requirement drops off, we expect that some of those units are going to continue to be affordable. And so even into the future. The 20-year program operates in the same way. You get a 20-year tax exemption. But in this case, those units that are reserved as affordable have to be put into permanent affordable status through a deed restriction.
Okay.
And so that's new. That was an addition to the MFTE law at the state level about a year or two ago. And so we have just implemented that. And I don't know that we've had any projects come forward and be constructed under that program, but that's also allowed anywhere in the city. And that has a little bit more flexibility in the types of housing. So there's a little more opportunity for home ownership opportunities under that program.
Oh, cool.
And again, those are housing opportunities that we want to see across our city. And so we didn't want to be artificially constraining where they could go.
Okay. So, and then real quick, you mentioned there's also a single family tax exempt program. Is that wrapped up in that 20-year program, or is that a kind of separate program that I thought I read on your website about like repairs to maybe homes that for folks in low income?
Yeah, that's right. So it's a similar idea to the multifamily tax exemption, but it's more limited. The way it works is if you own a single family home and you're making improvements to the house, if you qualify for our single family tax exemption program, you can have the increase in value from that work exempted from your tax bill for 3 years. Yeah. So if I make an addition on my house, or it actually applies to accessory dwelling units. So if I build an accessory dwelling unit in my backyard, that may have added $200,000 or $250,000 to my assessed value, and that would translate to a couple of $1,000s worth of taxes every year. That couple of $1,000s would be exempted for a 3-year period, and that's just a small inducement to try to encourage people to fix up their properties and potentially create some housing units.
Very cool. That's awesome. Well, and that seems to solve some of the. I know cities I've worked for, you have these maybe retirees on fixed incomes that are living in homes that are older and falling apart, but they don't want to make that, or either they can't afford to, or if they make that investment, now all of a sudden their property tax value goes through the roof. So that's interesting. It seems like a creative way to kind of help address some of those issues too.
Yeah, we'll have to talk another day about the problems, the problems in our property tax system and inequitable application of taxes. But you can have Joe Minicozy or somebody come on for that.
Yeah, no, yes, that's a much longer topic for another another episode.
Yeah,
awesome. Well, just to kind of wrap up, is there any what's next? What are you working on that our listeners maybe should look out for if they start following your Spokane's work?
Well, our council adopted another interim ordinance that removed requirements for off-street parking for residential units almost across the entire city. There are a few places that are not part of that, but we're working on that right now. Sort of the same approach, and it was very much tied to housing, recognizing that parking requirements are a particular challenge for the construction of new housing units. They made the decision to eliminate those requirements. Obviously, people are still going to build parking, but we're not going to force them to build parking the way that our code had been doing previously. That's on an interim basis, and so we need to do some work, and we are doing some work currently. Our proposal that comes forward in November for council approval will include something similar to the parking requirements. We've sort of presented it as a few different options, and so our plan commission hearing tomorrow will give us a little more clarity on where that ends up. But in some form or fashion, we will not be requiring parking going forward for certain types of residential projects. So that's a big one, I think, and there's still more work to do there. We talked about the neighborhood corner stores and neighborhood businesses. That's another big one. We have in 2026, we have our state mandated update to our comprehensive plan. It's 2023 right now, but we're already starting to gear up for that. It's a major process, and so that's going to take a lot of our attention. And in the meantime, we have lots of other efforts going on. There are several neighborhoods that we have committed to do neighborhood planning, and it's been a long process of planning all of the neighborhoods across the city, and there are a few left that we need to get to. So there's always something going on here, and I think on the housing side, our zoning update and then the parking stuff is pretty key right now.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that keeps it interesting. Always something going on. Yeah. All right, and then our traditional last question is always the hardest one for guests. But if you could be the Gov DJ, what song would you pick as the exit music for this episode?
It would be a song called "Outro" by the band Wolfpack.
Awesome, cool. We'll get that queued up, and with that ends our episode for today. Spencer, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me and sharing your work and all your expertise. This has been a great conversation.
Great. Well, thank you. I've had a good time.
Awesome. And for our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by engaging local government leaders. And the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. You can reach us online at elgl.org/GovLove. And you can follow ELGL at every social media service that's out there. So go ahead and give us a follow. Subscribe to GovLove on your favorite podcast app. And if you're already subscribed, share this podcast. Go tell a friend, a colleague about GovLove. Help us spread the word that we are the go-to place for local government stories. And with that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.